Clive Neeson is a physicist, inventor, and extreme sportsman, and he's produced a movie called Last Paradise. Today we're going to speak with him about his award-winning film that's making waves around the world. But first, let's look at a trailer from the movie.
In a land of virgin wilderness and extremes, when remoteness bred self-sufficiency and necessity was the mother of invention.
A lot of technology and a lot of toys just weren't available on the shelves.
It wasn't there to buy. You went and built it for yourself. You figured out how to make it and you made it.
A maverick few explored a new concept of fun. They found their nirvana in places others avoided. They found paradise in cultures known to few and long since lost. Share their antics, innovations and adventures as they pushed extreme limits for adrenaline or just pure fun.
Just couldn't believe the beauty of this form, you know. I decided I've got to jump off it.
40 years later, it's led to an industry and a new sports paradigm.
The most extreme form of surfing is using a jet engine that's been developed by a sheep farmer 50 years ago.
And the best investment for your kids would be to show them what a paradise it was and still can be.
I've seen so many paradises raped and pillaged. We're only here for such a small amount of time, and we should be leaving a nice footprint.
In the original spirit of extreme pioneers, relive the journey through the most comprehensive collation of stunning original footage.
Clive, you're dressed up perfectly for Hawaii. What brought you to the island?
Well, actually, Last Paradise has been screening in Honolulu Surf Film Festival, and we screened last year, and we were the audience favourite, so they invited us along for another screening, and I had a time slot, so I came over for it this time.
So you've been on Kauai and also on Oahu?
It's fantastic to screen it here because it's so relevant to these islands and any coastal or mountain community.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about the movie. We saw in the beginning that what the movie was about with a preview, but it's really hard to describe this movie because there's so much to it. But tell us about the movie and what drove you to make it.
Last Paradise is a 50-year story, and that is a story about fun and the evolution of adventure. But really underlying the film is the intention to nail the biggest issues which face our civilization and face the world today and tomorrow. Now, if you're making a documentary film, you're faced with the challenge of the people who are going to come are most likely to be already converted. They're already aware of the issues. So what we did with Last Paradise was to use the hook and fun of extreme adventure to capture a wider audience and subliminally address the big issues.
You're saying it's taking 50 years to make it. You brought in old film from the past, from your childhood, that was actually film, and then you incorporated it to modern day time. Tell us about that.
Last Paradise uses 50 years of original footage, and when that footage was filmed, the objective was to capture the action and the reality of the way the world was then. And the opportunity arose when we were able to restore it down at Park Road Post-Production, which is Peter Jackson's studios in Wellington. And the technology had just come of age to be able to take films of various formats and convert it into big screen quality. And the footage was actually first recorded by my mother in the 1950s when we lived in Africa. My parents were wildlife cinematographers. And then coming to New Zealand, a place where there were no wild animals, my parents started filming the way kids played then. They were intrigued by the fact we could play outside in the wilderness with no scary animals, and the things that we were getting up to, which they weren't able to in their childhood. And it was in that wilderness that we met other people who were also doing the same thing, and some of them filming as well. So during the 60s and 70s, we had this great archival collection of footage that was not only depicting the evolution of extreme sports, but also the way children played and the way the wilderness was.
I do want to talk to you about your mom and your dad, because they're such unusual parents.
My mother was raised in an orphanage, and it was that sense of deprivation, I think, that gave her such a huge appetite to see the world, and she endlessly marveled at the way the world was. That's what took her to Africa as a nurse, and that's why she spent all her money buying a camera and filming it, and that's really what started the footage of Last Paradise. And so I'm a great believer that adversity brings about good fruit, and I think she was a great example of that. And I think it was in the orphanage that the fact that there was an orchard or a tree that she could escape to at the back of the orphanage, which allowed her to get some kind of relationship with nature. And of course, you know, you can see in Last Paradise how that plays out in the same way, that we don't have those trees in our backyard today, the way, you know, the architecture and way things are being built. Unfortunately, children are not forming that bond with the wilderness. So it was not money at all, but an extraordinary appetite for adventure and a sense of wonder. And that's what we were raised in. We were raised in the place where we could see the night sky, where we could see the wild animals. They're all around us, and we could see the marvel of the creation that this planet is.
Tell us a little bit more about your family, because I'm just so curious as a parent myself.
My parents were wildlife cinematographers in Africa in an age when very few people were filming in Africa. So they saw the very early days when it was pretty wild, but also free to go wherever you went to go. And their objective, again, they had a sense of wonder, so their objective was to film certain things which they knew were going to change and which were very intriguing, both culturally and in terms of the wildlife.
And did your mom teach you how to film?
I got my own camera because she thought I was teaching her how to suck eggs. So I bought my own camera, which was a second-hand thing that I restored from a pawn shop. And then I was free to go my own way and didn't have to tell her how to do it, and vice versa. So we were both self-taught. My mother and me were both self-taught without each other's help.
Sounds like you two were exactly alike.
I guess we were. I like to think that all the people in Last Paradise were very alike. They're all powered and motivated by the very same thing. Was just this, they're totally wide-eyed about what an amazing place this planet was, and all the stuff that lies below the surface, and likewise the scientists in this movie, because that's why people became scientists, because they're so amazed by the stuff we couldn't see that they wanted to pursue and understand that. So I think we all had the same driving force, that sense of wonder which started as kids.
Tell us about your brothers, and how did they all enjoy that kind of life?
Well, I think the dangerous part of it when we were in Africa was pretty scary. I don't think we really enjoyed that because my parents may have, but they were taking some pretty strong calculated risks, and we were out there amongst the wild animals, which you can't do today, camping amongst them. And it was a very fearsome experience at times. But what it did give us was, I think, a comfort zone with danger. So when we came to a relatively safe place like New Zealand, we still had this expectation of danger, and so we went out into the wilderness, and our parents, of course, didn't know a lot of this, but we would take huge risks out there and want to take risks to, I suppose, reach that same level of feeling of danger, which was our comfort zone. It's a strange thing to say that it's a comfort zone, but I think that can happen. The wilderness and a sense of danger becomes the norm, and so to to keep life buzzing along as a kid, you want to keep introducing that, exploring, and New Zealand was a fantastic place to be able to do that with its physical geography and all the unknown and no limitations at all.
Do you have a favorite moment or a most startling moment that you can remember as a child in Africa and maybe also with New Zealand? Is there something that sticks out on you where you came face to face with a lion, which you did in the movie, or an elephant, or is there something that happened that you remember that was just amazing?
The wilderness of Africa that relate to danger and things that relate to extraordinary beauty, and I think they're the two key driving factors of Last Paradise. In terms of danger, I think probably the most memorable occasion was when my parents were trying to change a tyre and a rhinoceros was starting to move in on us. And then when my father tried to start the car, it wouldn't start. It made a strange noise, and then a herd of elephants, male elephants, came charging out of the bush and started throwing their trunks around and mauling the car over. And we were all just screaming in the back of the car, and my mother was absolute despair. It was beyond filming because it was survival. And finally the car started and my father revved it up and the elephants moved back. But for about half an hour it was a truly terrifying experience. And of course wild animals weren't used to cars back then. It wasn't always in game parks. And animals were everywhere in Africa back then. This was pre-poaching. And so the world was dominated by animals. Mankind was on its back foot. And that's what we try and bring out in Last Paradise, that only one generation ago, 50 years ago, humans were not the king of this planet. And you see that in real footage in Last Paradise. In terms of extraordinary beauty in Africa, I do remember one occasion where I was just with my mother. I was probably about 5 years old, and we walked along a beach to a massive rock pool. And inside that rock pool was every fish you could possibly imagine, every kind of coral, every color you could possibly imagine. And that was a changing point in my life. I realized the amazement of that, and my mother never stopped talking about it till the day she died. And sadly, that rock pool's now just a mud rock pool, like many others, and I think I've spent my life trying to find the same representation of nature as the way it should be. I haven't found it yet. And I think once again that's been a genesis of not only Last Paradise but my personal journey. And a point of despair. People fail to realize just what the world used to be and what is normal for this planet. And they are becoming used to a different norm. And with every generation we lose sight of what should be on this planet.
You have the contrast between Africa and New Zealand, and you said it felt safer. Maybe you can tell me more about New Zealand.
New Zealand is known as being a really extraordinary place, and I think one of those reasons is it's a very young country. So you'll find extremes of nature, extremes of geography there, and that is the perfect setting for devising forms of adventure. And that's why New Zealand has become the world capital of extreme sports. So it was a perfect place to start this other journey of extreme sports innovation, which drives Last Paradise. Another aspect of New Zealand is it was very isolated then. So we had this endless quest for what is the world like? What's the rest of the world like? We didn't have the media. We assumed the rest of the world held more adventures. And so the next stage as teenagers or post-teenagers was to go out and explore the world and find what was there, what kind of adventures, and take these sports that we'd discovered or invented to other countries. And that was the beginning, I suppose, of this third chapter in the movie, where we go out inspired by Nicky Dora, who was a great surfer who came to New Zealand in the early 70s, who challenged us to go out and find paradise. We already had this sense of paradise search from this childhood dream. And when we became teenagers, then the natural thing was to go and take that to the world, to go and find what the world was about. And so the third chapter of Last Paradise is where we take off with no expectations, but to find the ultimate adventure paradise in the world. And once again, we take the camera with us in the backpack with a tent, sleeping bag, pots and pans.
What about sharing some of those with the viewers?
So in one country, in Bali, we realized that wealth is contentment. In Mexico, we realized that wealth is the simplicity and happiness. In Portugal, we realized that it's about culture and tradition. And of course, you can see today that we've misconstrued that because we've swapped that wealth for money. And this is one of the big outplays you'll see in evidence in the film of Last Paradise in the last chapter today, is how the whole paradigm has shifted. And it's shifted to a direction which is not necessarily heading down the right road. I always leave the audience to make their own conclusions, but what we are able to do is show them in real footage a world that few people have seen, and there they will make their own judgment.
Why did you call the movie Last Paradise?
The movie's about that search for paradise that we all have, and every human has it, and that's what we're really searching for. In the context of extreme sports people and adventurers, I think that Last Paradise relates to a place in the world, and as the audience will see, there are some amazing paradises that existed on this planet in the 60s, and towards the end of the movie, we'll see how they changed. We'll see what happened to them and why it happened to them. And I won't spoil the storyline, but let's say there's a total inversion of the paradigm to the point where the very place that we considered to be anything but paradise in the early 70s is now the last paradise.
Well, what do you think your parents would think of this film?
Oh, you know, the saddest thing about this film is that my parents never got to see it. They died just before I finished it, and I wanted to get it perfect before they were going to see it on the big screen. But I think they would have been overwhelmed to even imagine that any of the footage that they filmed in the 50s of Africa and of us children ever made it into a big screen film. It would have been beyond their expectations, but they would have been very chuffed and very proud, I think. It's just so sad they didn't.
Maybe share some of the more humorous moments from your movie.
Something that people seem to laugh at. You know, when you're trying to evaluate your own movie, you listen to the audience. And something that really grabs a lot of laughs is when the kids were playing in the mud at Raglan. I mean, Raglan is one of the world's #1 surf spots now, but then there were very few people that even knew about the place. But the most exciting thing that ever happened in Raglan was skidding on the mud surfing, it was called. So here's this original footage that my mother had actually filmed of the kids at Raglan inventing a new sport on this water-covered mud that was like no other in the world, but actually it grew out of a massive deforestation campaign. And today it's a severe tragedy. And of course it can be fixed, but people don't realize that what they see before them day to day, the brown water in the oceans and the mud flats, is actually a tragic consequence of something that we need to change. But to deal with it in a fun sense, we introduced this old footage and the desperation of the kids that lived in Raglan to try and imitate surfing in Malibu in California through an old photograph, and they found mud surfing, not realizing that just over the hill was some of the best surf in the world. And of course the next scene is the discovery of that surf. So it was a way of propelling a serious and tragic environmental lesson by absolute fun and adventure.
For the geeks out there who love film, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the cameras you used or the technical things that you did?
Yeah, to give the audience a true impression and to hook them and excite them all the way through the movie, I tried to use a method in sound, in vision, and in music. I think you can achieve more by filming from the right perspective in motion than you can by using binocular 3D, which seems to be the popular thing these days. And I always believed that from the late 60s. When I first picked up a camera at the age of 15, I experimented with it to see how I could get the audience feeling like they're in the action, and not just from building rigs and waterproof housings. It was about the angles and the perspectives and that sense of changing background, that you could fool the audience into actually being there. And the second way that you can give the audience a sense of being there is to actually create your sound in the same way that's done in blockbuster movies, which is not usually done in action sports movies. So whilst you have scenes that are filmed several years apart, they appear as if they're filmed in the very same moment by using strong sound effects that are smoothing one shot to the next. And the third way is in the music. We created the music for Last Paradise wherever we could by writing the lyrics to suit the storyline. So not only do the people tell the story, but the music is enhancing, and the lyrics of the music is enhancing the story, but also the emotion that we're trying the audience to feel at the same time. And if you use all three of those, the vision, the sound, and the music, and if you use them in concert, then it can be very powerful, and it hooks the audience in.
What about some of the inventions that came out of this movie? You showed how you created different kinds of surfboards and windsurfer. Tell us a little bit about all these wonderful things that came out of the movie that you were able to create through your life.
Mm-hmm. One of the reasons I made Last Paradise was to reawaken the spirit of innovation. And to make that fun, I think there's no more powerful and fun story as the innovation of extreme sports. And you know, that came out of New Zealand. And many people ask me, why is it that these innovators all seem to know each other? And the real reason was because most people were involved in traditional sports and they didn't have the time or freedom to wander into the wilderness. But those people who did, and there was really a very small group of them, all met very quickly. And I think one of the, apart from their childhood pursuits, as they became teenagers, it was actually surfing that was the first progenitor of that search for fun and adventure that actually got the people together. And out of that came all these other sports, bungee jumping, hang gliding, windsurfing. And the objective in doing that was to tap this amazing source of energy that we have in New Zealand, as well as the physical diversity of it.
There was a scene in the movie that was pretty memorable where you were talking about creating a windsurfer and you stuck a toilet plunger on a board. How did so many innovations come from this? I mean, you just thought, explain that a little bit.
Yes, a lot of the innovations, of course, in the early days were very comical because we had nothing. And of course, that is one of the driving forces of innovation, is deprivation. We were an island in New Zealand. We had this amazing energy source, the wind, the waves, and the volcanoes and so on, but we didn't have any equipment. We had to invent everything. And as you see, the story almost starts on a sheep farm where even the sheep farmers had to invent their own ways of doing things. And this spirit of innovation was born of not having stuff, as you do today. And of course, you can see today, why would you want to invent stuff? It's already available on the shelves. So yeah, we had to go out there and invent things from grassroots, that grassroots ingenuity. And of course it was very comical. A lot of it was done in the chicken shed. You had an old chicken shed that your father wasn't using or on the farm. You blew the cobwebs out and you converted it into a little experimental laboratory. And that's where you shaped your various devices and made up even your camera rigs. I made my camera rigs in a chicken shed. So that's quite comical, and we did film that as we went. So we incorporated all that daggy stuff, as we call it in New Zealand, into the whole story of innovation.
Tell us about the wave machine that you invented. Why did you invent it?
The way in which we introduced the gas crisis of the 1970s, or in fact the whole issue of energy and the fact that it's running out, is to once again incorporate it into a fun story. Now in 1973, we were all faced globally with a gas crisis where we not only didn't have gasoline, but when we did, it was rationed. So in terms of the adventures that we were faced with, we were looking for a way in which we could predict, for example, surf and use our gasoline rations most astutely. And the only way to do that effectively was to predict when the surf was coming. And at that stage, there was no understanding of what caused these amazing ground swells to come out of nowhere in perfectly fine weather. And so the challenge was to understand what created waves, but also how and when they would arrive in their best form, so that you could use your gasoline rations to go to the coastline only when the surf was perfect. That was the motive, and it was an incredibly strong motive, because if you did do that, you would have all this adventure to yourself. The way to do that, of course, is using classical physics, and first starting off with the theory to predict mathematically how it works, and secondarily using experimentation. So we started off using the laws of physics as applied to light waves, because there was absolutely no documentation in university libraries about how waves, water waves, were formed and how to predict their arrival. So using classical physics and mathematics, we could derive a formula as to how that would happen using the parallel of light waves as they're formed in fusion storms on the sun's surface. So once the theory had been worked out, then the next stage was to experimentally verify it and fine-tune it. And at that stage, back in the early 70s, there weren't computers. There weren't laboratory-sized computers or PCs. So what was required was a data acquisition machine that could measure the wave height and frequency and period, and in fact all the weather parameters. And the only way to do it back then was to actually design it and build it from scratch. And it's the way everything was done back then. So that resulted in a lot of circuit board design and a lot of electronics, and once again physics. And physics is always the basis of electronics, electronic engineering. And out of that came a machine that was able to verify the model and fine-tune it. And it led to many decades of, I suppose, uncrowded surf.
You got to travel around the world and do all these things, and you lived, I mean, it showed you living simply. But how did you get the resources to be able to travel and things like that? Did you made surfboards and sold them, or how did it work with all of the kids?
I think one of the main challenges for anybody who has a passion is to be able to fuel and finance that passion. And in the sense of, be it art or extreme sports, it's not going to come out of doing it. So you have to, I suppose, pursue another career. For me, that career was as physics and electronic engineering. But for many of the people in this journey of adventure, it was actually the experimentation and innovation that they did in the sports that led to their careers, whether it was bungee jumping or innovation of windsurfing or whatever. And that led on to things way bigger than they ever could have imagined.
Maybe leading into that, you can talk about some of the main people in this movie, just maybe just real briefly. How did you meet them, and where are they now?
The main characters of this movie met in the wilderness. They met in the very place where day to day they were doing what they loved. And they are a very small group. So we are all destined to meet in the end, I think. But the funny thing is that when you pursue things like adventure and danger, you have a very good handle on technical things, and even to be able to survive in the places that you want to travel to. And so one of the ingredients, or one of the traits of these people was they also were able to innovate careers as they needed to further down the line. That sense of innovation that came out of pursuing adventure is what actually led to them being able to develop careers out of what they love doing.
Are you still in contact with any of your friends from the movie?
We pretty much see each other on a day-to-day basis, because not only do you pursue the same things, but you seek the same lifestyle in often the same place. And so you end up living in the same villages. And there are a few of these around the world. If we're not living there, we're visiting there. So we see a lot of each other.
What are you wanting people to learn from this movie? You've talked a lot about that, but maybe you can sum it up. What lessons do you want them to take away?
The objective of the film is to make that link between adventure, sense of wonder, and science. And so in nailing the biggest issues that the world faces today, the solutions lie in science. And they lie with people, very few people, who do not have a great voice today. And one of the purposes in Last Paradise was to let the world hear what they have to say, what the real big issues are, and give them some voice, and in a way that's very palatable and exciting.
Where do you see this going in terms of where will your film be played? How will you distribute it?
So far, the film's only been released in New Zealand in cinemas, but the objective is to slowly take it around the world. At the moment, it's just shown in film festivals to get a kind of feel, a thermometer for how it's received in various countries. And so as a result of that, it's been very well received in the USA and in Europe at the initial festivals, so we do want to take it around the cinemas of USA and Europe. But to do that, we'll probably need a major sponsor. And that's a sponsor who has a strong environmental program and sense of responsibility, because I have to say the film really does garner a lot of respect for those who are behind it. So I will be working hard to find the right sponsor.
What do you see as the next film or project that you'll do after you've taken this one around the world? Do you have that in your mind yet?
I started filming this film when I was 15 years old, you know, and I finished it a year ago. Not even that. I finished it 6 months ago. And so what's that? How many years is that? It's a lifetime. It's been a lifetime in the making. So do the maths. I don't know if I've got many films left in me. I think there's enough in Last Paradise to be able to say all I want to say and to present the best stuff that I and other people in the past have filmed to tell this story. So I think the next project is getting this film out there. I believe Last Paradise could profoundly change the world and help solve the big problems that we face ahead, if everyone can get to see it. And that's the biggest challenge, is getting it out there, because I'm an independent filmmaker. I have limited resources. It was 100% self-financed in the production. So the only way I can get it out there is to reinvent a way of getting it out there. So that's going to be the challenge over the next 5 years, is getting Last Paradise out to cinemas and then out to distribution. But I don't think I can do any better than focus on this one film.
What would you have to say to some of the kids today, if you had to address some kids right now? What advice would you give them about the world and about how they should maybe possibly live their life?
Kids today are faced with many challenges, but some of those challenges have been faced by all generations, and that is the challenges of career. What's going to happen to the world? How's it going to change? How am I going to adapt to change? And I think the key thing for a child is to learn how to find the answers for yourself. Be self-propelled. Don't just rely on hearsay, but work it out for yourself. And to arm children with that. And also to develop your own dream, something that you genuinely in your heart are passionate about, so that your career, your life choices, the place you live, and so on, is come about from that, and it's derived straight from that, because that's how you'll achieve happiness. Obviously, those things that you really love in your heart, they'll lead to your childhood dream. It's your childhood dream that will lead to the choices in life, and if you're in touch with all that, it'll lead to the best choices for you, including your career. There's a lot of challenges ahead in this world. We need to know what the world was, where it's going, to find our own way in it. And I'm afraid the education system of today is not leading kids down that track. It's not allowing them the freedom to go and explore for themselves physically, because they're wrapped in cotton wool these days, and also broadening the picture of where we're going. The key is that spirit of innovation and that sense of wonder. And if we can change that in the education system, then I think we'll lead kids on the right track.
It sounds like students would be really benefit from watching your movie in schools. Have you thought about taking it to the schools?
Absolutely. When we premiered the film in Santa Barbara in the States, it immediately was recognized by the professors over there, and we were invited to screen it back again. And that gave us the notion that Last Paradise could become a great educational tool just by screening it itself. And we will, down the track, develop lesson plans to go in association with it. After we've done the public cinema screenings, we'll follow through with education. And that was the purpose of making the film, that it excited people, and it really does excite both parents and children, all generations, to propel themselves and go and pursue something, and a childhood dream and a life dream for themselves. So that's what it was created for, and that will be its ultimate destination. But we do need key people in the world to wake up to the value and potential for it. That part I can't do on my own, as that it needs to be put before the right people, and then it'll do the work that it was created to do, and I think profoundly change the world.
Last Paradise will be making its way around the world in film festivals and hopefully in a movie theater near you. But in the meantime, you can check out more about Last Paradise at lastparadisefilm.com.